everybody, welcome to Board Online, Board Offline. Today we're bringing you a how to play Twilight Imperium 4 video. Now this is a game that I wanted to play for a long time. Finally got it at the table just recently. This is actually not my copy that I'm using here. This is a friend of mine who purchased the game, gave it to me because he wanted me to learn the rules instead of him learning the rules. And we did that, played the game. It was such a good time. But while I had it, I decided to get a how to play video filmed of it because it's probably my only opportunity, at least in the near future. So let's get down to the table and we'll show you how to play Twilight Imperium 4. But before we do get down to the table, I want to mention our sponsor, Board Game Co. This is a great website where you can go and buy fantastic games for great prices. Also though, you can sell games over there and you can trade games over at Board Game Co. A lot of great things over there as far as adjusting your collection, making some changes, getting the old games out, the new games in. Board Game Co. is a great website where you can buy, sell, and trade your way into a better collection. All right, let's get down to the table and I'll show you how to play Twilight Imperium 4th edition. The purpose of the Learn to Play booklet is to teach new players how to play Twilight Imperium. It's recommended that players read the Learn to Play booklet in its entirety before playing for the first time. The game also includes a rules reference. This describes detailed rules and exceptions that are omitted from the Learn to Play booklet. As questions arise during the game, players should consult the rules reference instead of the Learn to Play booklet. Now let's discuss some key concepts of the game. During a game of Twilight Imperium, each player's units are represented by these plastic figures. There are three types of units: ships, ground forces, and structures. The ships represent spacefaring units. Players use these units to engage one another in space combat and expand their empires to new systems. Ground forces represent foot soldiers. Players use these units to invade planets or defend their territories. And structures represent military installations built by an empire to support its war efforts. A player's personal supply of unused units and unused command tokens are her reinforcements. When producing units and gaining command tokens during the game, players will take these components from their reinforcements. The game board for Twilight Imperium is formed using modular system tiles such as this one. Each tile represents a single system in the galaxy which may contain one or more planets or other celestial bodies. When a unit is placed in a system, it is placed in one of two areas on the tile. Structures and ground forces are generally placed on a planet, while ships are placed in space. As players move about the galaxy and expand their empire beyond their home systems, they will gain control of new planets. When a player gains control of a planet, he takes that planet's card from either the deck of planet cards or from the player who controlled it previously and places it face down in his play area. Each planet card displays two values on both the front and back of the card: resources on the left in yellow and influence on the right in blue. As you can see, these match what's on the system tile. Players spend resources to acquire new units and technologies, and players spend influence to gain command tokens and to vote during the agenda phase. If a player ever controls a planet but has no units on that planet, she instead places one of her control tokens on that planet. The Learn to Play guide provides a modified first game setup that removes some options from the players that may be more complex. However, in this video, I'll be teaching the complete setup, which is found in the rules reference. The first step for the setup is to randomly determine one player to gain the speaker token. Whoever that player is now known as the speaker. Personally, I like to pick whichever player most recently visited outer space. Each player then chooses one faction sheet. This faction will be their faction for the entire game. Each player then takes one home system tile, 17 control tokens, 16 command tokens, one faction promissory note, 2 faction technologies, and any faction-specific tokens. It should be noted, however, with regards to faction-specific tokens, that only the Nalu Collective, the Necrovirus, and the Ghosts of Kreus have faction-specific tokens. It should also be noted that while the system has the faction icon here, it's also listed on the back of the faction sheet here. Each player then chooses a faction color and takes the following components: one command sheet, 59 plastic units, 25 technology cards, and 4 promissory notes. The player then combines the color-specific technology cards and the faction-specific technology cards into one deck, and the color-specific promissory cards and the faction-specific promissory cards into one deck. Then these decks are placed into her play area. Next, each player takes the planet cards that correspond to the planet or planets in her home system and places them face up in the play area. Next, place the Mechatol Rex system tile in the center of the common play area. This will be the center of the galaxy. The galaxy will consist of 3 rings of systems around Mechatol Rex, and each player's home system will be set in a position in the 3rd ring. Players should use this game board setup diagram to estimate where players' home systems will be placed based on each player's position around the game area. Then they'll create the game board following these steps. First, separate the system tiles into 2 piles using the color on the back of each tile. One for the blue back tiles and one for the red back tiles. Green back system tiles are home systems and are not separated into piles in this way. Next, shuffle each pile of system tiles face down. Then, deal them face down to each player according to the player count based on these bullet points. It should be noted that for a 5-player game, 1 additional system tile will be needed. So before placing system tiles, the speaker draws 1 random red back system tile and places it face up in any space adjacent to Mechatol Rex. First, the players place their home systems in the approximate positions where they will connect to the galaxy. So for a 3-player game, it may look something like this. Then, starting with the speaker and proceeding clockwise, each player places 1 system tile face up in the 1st ring around Mechatol Rex. After the last player has placed her first tile, she places a 2nd tile, and the order of tile placement reverses, proceeding counterclockwise until it reaches the speaker again. At this point, the speaker will place a 2nd tile once again, and the order will reverse. This process continues like this until all players have placed all of their tiles. While setting up the board, it's important to remember that each ring around Mechatol Rex must be fully completed before the next ring may begin. It's also important to remember that anomaly system tiles such as these may not be placed next to each other unless there is no other option. So that placement never would have occurred in an actual game setup. Also, any system with a wormhole, such as this one or this one, may not be placed next to each other if they have the same type of wormhole. The final step in building the board is for the players to attach their home systems to the galaxy. Also, during a 5-player game, 3 players will be at a slight disadvantage based on their home system's starting position on the game board. Because of this, after creating the game board, those players receive trade goods based on their positions. You can see on the diagram it indicates how many trade goods they should receive. Next, place the Custodian Token on Mechatol Rex. Shuffle the decks for the action cards, agenda cards, Stage 1 and Stage 2 objective cards, and secret objective cards. Place these decks in the common play area. Create separate piles in the common play area for the infantry tokens, fighter tokens, and trade good tokens, which are also the commodity tokens. Place each of the 8 strategy cards face up in the common play area within reach of the speaker. They will also gain any starting technologies listed here from the common technology deck that is identical for each color. In this case, the anti-mass deflectors and the neural motivator. Each player also receives the listed starting units, in this case, 2 carriers, 1 destroyer, 3 fighters, 5 infantry, and 1 space dock. Each player should place their units in their home system, and the starting technology card should be placed face up near the faction sheet. Each player then places 3 command tokens in their tactics pool, 3 command tokens in the fleet pool with the ship side face up, and 2 command tokens in the strategy pool. Each player draws 2 secret objectives, chooses 1 to keep, and the other one is shuffled back into the secret objective deck. Neither card should be revealed to the other players. Place the victory point track near the game board, and players should decide collectively if they're using the 10-point side or the 14-point side. Obviously, the 14-point side is going to be a longer game. Each player then places one of their control tokens on the 0 space. The speaker then deals 5 face-down Stage 1 objectives above this track, and then 5 Stage 2 objectives below the track. And finally, the speaker reveals the first 2 Stage 1 objectives. And that's the setup. Twilight Imperium is played over a series of game rounds, each of which contains the following 4 phases that players resolve in order: strategy phase, action phase, status phase, and agenda phase. These phases will repeat in successive game rounds until one player accumulates 10 victory points and wins the game. We're going to go into each of these phases in detail, so let's start with the strategy phase. During the strategy phase, players will take turns selecting a strategy card that provides them with a unique action they can use during the action phase. First-time players may not know which strategy card to choose and should consult the chart at the bottom of page 8 and 9 of the Learn to Play guide, which gives a general overview of each of these cards. Beginning with the speaker and continuing clockwise, each player will select a strategy card. They place this card face up near their faction sheet. This strategy card is no longer available to any other player during this game round. In a 3-player game, as we're playing here, or in a 4-player game, after each player has selected a strategy card, players will repeat the process so that each player will have 2 strategy cards. This means that in a 4-player game, all strategy cards will always be chosen. After each player has chosen their strategy card or strategy cards, the speaker places 1 trade good on each card that was not chosen. During future strategy phases, when a player chooses a strategy card that has 1 or more trade goods on it, she gains those trade goods. Each strategy card has a number between 1 and 8, in this case 4, in the top right corner. During the action phase, players will take turns in order according to the number printed on their chosen strategy card. This starts with the number 1, and this is called the initiative order. In a 3- and 4-player game, the initiative order is only determined by the lowest numbered strategy card. So let's say player 1 had leadership and politics, player 2 had warfare and trade, and player 3 had diplomacy and imperial. Well, in this particular round, the order of play will be player 1, followed by player 3, and then player 2. This even means that once a strategy card has been used, the initiative number still applies. The action phase is the main phase of the game, during which players produce units, move ships, enact strategies, and interact with other players. During the action phase, players take turns in initiative order. When a player is taking a turn, he is considered the active player and can perform 1 action. After each player has taken a turn, player turns begin again in initiative order, and initiative order may repeat in this manner several times within a single phase. The action phase does not end until each player has passed. There are 3 types of actions a player may take: strategic actions, component actions, and tactical actions. If a player does not wish to perform an action during his turn, he may pass. After a player passes, his turn is skipped for the remainder of the action phase. A player cannot pass, though, until he has performed his strategic action. In a 3- and 4-player game, both strategic actions must be performed before a player can pass. Once all players have passed, the game round continues to the status phase. So let's talk about tactical actions in detail first. Activation, movement, space combat, invasion, and production are the 5 steps of a tactical action. A player may resolve some or all of these steps during their tactical action. However, these must be resolved in that order. To take a tactical action, the first thing the active player must do is the activation step. The active player chooses one system that she would like to make the focus of her tactical action. She activates the system by taking a command token from her tactic pool and placing it on the system. This system will now be the active system for the remainder of this tactical action. A player may never activate a system that already has one of her command tokens on it, but may activate one that has another player's command token on it. Also, a player may not activate a system at all if there are no command tokens in her tactic pool. During the movement step of a tactical action, the active player may choose to move some of her units into the active system. Each ship has a move value printed on its faction sheet. The move value indicates how far that ship can travel to reach the active system. For example, a ship with a move value of 1 can only move to adjacent systems. Let's say that the red player found herself in this situation, and this is the active system. To resolve the movement step, this player would choose any of her units that can move into the active system and place them in that system. However, when moving, ships must obey the following rules. The ship must end its movement in the active system. The ship cannot pass through a system that contains another player's ship, excluding fighters. And a player cannot move units out of a system that contains one of her command tokens. So in this current setup, all of these ships are capable of moving to this system. So let's say the red player found herself in this situation. This is still the active system, and she wants to bring her forces down on this system. Well, she can't move this ship because this cruiser is in the way. She can move this ship because it's just a fighter here, and ships can move through systems with fighters. She could move this ship as well, except that it only has move 2 and would have to end here, and ships must end in the destination system. And this ship has nothing in its way, and it's close enough, but it already has a command token in this system, so it cannot move either. Some ships have a capacity value. For instance, the Advanced Carrier 2 has a capacity of 8. When one of these ships moves, it may transport a number of fighters and or ground forces in any combination up to the ship's capacity value. So in this case, with 5 ground troops and 3 fighters, this transport could carry all of that with it. Transported ground forces and fighters move to the active system along with the ship that is transporting them, and these units must remain with the ship in the space area. They are not immediately put onto the ground. However, ground forces may be able to land on the planet during the invasion step, which is coming up. Ships may also pick up and transport ground forces and fighters from systems as they pass through them, as long as they don't contain any command tokens. So, transport can move here with this fighter, pick up these ground forces, and continue on to here. Let's discuss one more key concept regarding capacity. The number of fighters and ground forces that a player has in the space area of a system cannot exceed the combined capacity of that player's ships in that system. So for example, these 2 dreadnoughts each have a capacity of 1. So this one has 1 ground force in space with it, and this one has a fighter. However, it's important to understand that ground forces on planets do not count against this number. If at any time the number of players, fighters, and ground forces in a space area of a system exceeds the capacity of his ships in that system, the excess units are immediately destroyed. However, it should be noted that during combat, a player's fighters and ground forces may exceed the ship's capacity, and likely even will as ships are destroyed. But at the end of the combat, any excess units are destroyed at that time. Some systems contain wormholes. There are 2 basic types of wormhole: alpha and beta. Systems that contain identical wormholes, as you see here, are considered adjacent for all purposes. Some systems contain anomalies. They can be identified by these red brackets around the system. Anomalies restrict movement and have special rules governing them. A ship cannot move through or into a supernova at all. A ship that moves through or out of a gravity rift first applies +1 to its move value and then rolls 1 die. On a result of 1 through 3, the ship is destroyed. A ship cannot move through a nebula, but may move into it. While a ship is in a nebula, if it is a defender, it applies +1 to the result of each of its combat rolls. And then a ship moving out of a nebula has a move value of 1. And finally, a ship cannot move through or into an asteroid field. After the active player finishes moving ships into the active system, each player's units in the active system may use their space cannon abilities if they have any. These can only be used against the active player's ships in that system. Also, if the active player's units have any space cannon abilities, they may be used at this time as well. We'll discuss space cannons in detail during the unit abilities section of this video. At the end of the movement step, if multiple players have ships in the active system, they must resolve a space combat in that system. During this combat, the active player is known as the attacker, and the other player is known as the defender. Space combat is resolved in a 5-step process. The first step is the anti-fighter barrage. If any of the ships involved in the space combat have the ability anti-fighter barrage, such as this Destroyer 1, it's used at this time. We'll discuss anti-fighter barrage in the unit ability section of this video. The second step is announce retreat. Either player may choose to announce a retreat. However, the retreat will not happen immediately. Instead, the units will retreat at the end of the combat round. If a player wishes to retreat with any of the ground forces that are currently on the planets in the active system, he must remove them from the planets to the space area during this step. Each player then rolls a die for each ship in the active system. If the result of that unit's die roll is equal to or greater than that unit's combat value shown on the faction sheet, that roll produces a hit. For instance, the Advanced Carrier 2, the Destroyer 1, and the Fighter 1 would all need to roll a 9 or higher in order to hit. Also, if this 2-burst symbol is shown on the faction sheet for that particular ship, then the player rolls the number of dice equal to the number of burst icons, meaning that that ship could potentially produce more than one hit. The fourth step is assign hits. Each player must choose and destroy one of his ships for each hit his opponent produced. These removed ships will be placed in the reinforcements for the player. Let's say the red player rolled only a single hit against the blue player. In that case, the blue player likely is going to assign that hit to this fighter since it's cheap to replace. And the fifth step is to retreat. If a player announced a retreat during the first step of the combat round, at this point they retreat. To retreat, the player takes all of their ships from the combat and places them in an adjacent system. The chosen system cannot contain ships that belong to another player and must contain either a planet they control or at least one of their units. Otherwise, the player cannot retreat at all. If the chosen system does not already contain one of that player's command tokens, the player must take a command token from their reinforcements and place it on the system. If both players still have units in space after the retreat step, then they must resolve another round of combat starting with announce retreat. They do not do another round of anti-fighter barrage. After all units on one or both sides of the combat have been destroyed or have retreated, play proceeds to the invasion step. To be clear, some objectives will require a player to win combat. A player has won a space combat if their ships are the only ships left in the active system when the combat has ended. And keep in mind, since this PDS is on the planet's surface, it does not cause combat to continue. The first step for invasion is bombardment. If any planets in the active system contain another player's ground forces, the active player may use the bombardment ability of any of the units that he has in that system. We'll cover bombardment in more detail during the unit abilities section of this video. Next, the active player decides which ground forces to commit to land on the planet. To do this, the player takes any of the ground forces that are currently in space with him and places them on whichever planet they wish to invade. The third step is space cannon defense. If another player has a PDS, as you see here, on any of the planets the active player has committed ground forces to, that player may be able to destroy some of those ground forces before they land. The space cannon ability, as I've already said, will be described in detail in the unit ability section. The fourth step is ground combat. If multiple players have ground forces on the same planet, those players resolve a ground combat. Ground combats on multiple planets are resolved in the order of the active player's choice. Players resolve ground combat over a number of rounds that each consist of 2 steps, following the same rules as space combat. Make combat rolls and assign hits. And after assigning hits, just as with space combat, if multiple players have units remaining on the planet, they resolve another round of ground combat starting with make combat rolls. After all units on one side or both sides of the combat have been destroyed, proceed to the next step, establish control. The active player now gains control of each invaded planet that still contains at least one of her ground forces. When a player gains control of a planet, she takes the 2 corresponding planet cards, exhausted side up, and places them in her play area. Then, if the planet contains any structures that belong to another player, those structures are destroyed. Many effects in Twilight Imperium require a player to spend resources or influence. To spend a planet's resources or influence, a player exhausts that planet's card, like this. In doing so, the player now has 4 resources or 2 influence to spend. The player can exhaust multiple planets at once to combine their values, and the player can exhaust a planet that has more resources than required, but the excess is always lost. The final step of the tactical action is production. The active player can produce units using her space docks in the active system. When a player produces units, she may choose to produce any of the units on her faction sheet by spending resources equal to the chosen unit's cost. When a unit is produced, the player takes the unit from her reinforcements and places it in the active system. Players always place ships in the space area of the system in which they were produced, and players always place ground forces on the planet that contains the space dock that produced them. When producing multiple units at the same time, the cost values of those units are added together. Each space dock's production ability has a value that limits the number of units it can produce during this step. As you see here, this unit's production value is equal to 2 more than the resource value of this planet, and the resource value is 4, so it could produce 6 units, assuming the player could pay for them. If a unit's cost is accompanied by 2 unit icons, as you see here and here, the player receives 2 units for the indicated cost. However, each individual unit does count against the production limit. If a player ever wishes to produce a unit but does not have any units of that type available in her reinforcements, she may instead remove one of that type of unit from a system that does not contain one of her command tokens on the game board and return it to her reinforcements in order to be produced. The exception to this is when a player produces a fighter or infantry unit but none are available. She can instead use these fighter tokens as a replacement. These tokens function identically to the plastic figures of that type. However, they must be accompanied by at least 1 plastic figure of that type in order to know who it belongs to. If a player's space docks are in the same system as another player's ships, those space docks are blockaded, which means they cannot produce ships. They may, however, still produce ground forces. Now that we've finished discussing the tactical action in detail, let's talk about the strategic action. Each strategy card has both a primary ability and a secondary ability. When a player performs a strategic action, she resolves the primary ability of that strategy card. After she has finished resolving this ability, each other player may resolve the secondary ability. The active player may never resolve the secondary ability, and the other players may never resolve the primary ability. After each player has an opportunity to resolve a strategy card's secondary ability, the active player then exhausts the card by flipping it over. Players may never resolve abilities on exhausted strategy cards, but the card's numbers are still used to determine initiative order. And remember, a player cannot pass during the action phase unless their strategy card is exhausted. This means that each player must perform a strategic action at some point during the action phase, which guarantees that each other player has an opportunity to resolve the secondary ability. Even players who have already passed may still resolve secondary abilities of other players' strategy cards. Finally, let's talk about the third type of action, component actions. A component action is an action that is printed on a game component, such as orbital drop. As you can see, it says action right there before describing what happens. Players will find these on action cards, faction sheets, and even some technology cards. These effects will always be preceded by the word action. Successfully navigating the action phase in Twilight Imperium requires careful management of command tokens. When a player gains a command token, she places it in any one of the 3 pools. As you've already seen, command tokens in the tactics pool allow players during the action phase to perform tactical actions. Anytime a player places a command token in the fleet pool, it's always with the ship silhouette face up. These command tokens are not spent like the command tokens in the other pools. Instead, the number of tokens in the fleet pool is the maximum number of ships, excluding fighters, that the player can have in each system. If a player ever has more ships in a system than she has tokens in her fleet pool, she must return ships from that system to her reinforcements immediately, until the number of ships in that system no longer exceeds the number of tokens in her fleet pool. Most secondary abilities on strategy cards will require players to spend tokens from the strategy pool. Players will want to keep tokens in this pool so they can use the secondary abilities of other players' strategy cards. Once all players have passed and the action phase ends, the status phase is next. During the status phase, players will perform various upkeep tasks, including repairing units and scoring objectives. The status phase consists of 8 steps that must be performed in this order. The first step is score objectives. In initiative order, each player may score up to 1 public and 1 secret objective, assuming, of course, the player fulfills those cards' requirements. Scoring objectives is the primary way in which players will gain victory points to win the game. We'll talk about objectives a little bit more in just a minute. The second step is to reveal the next public objective. The speaker flips the next objective over, which is now available to complete. All the stage 1 objectives must be flipped over before the stage 2 objectives begin being flipped over. Each player then draws 1 action card from the action card deck. Players remove all command tokens from the board, returning them to their reinforcements. Each player then gains 2 command tokens from her reinforcements and may redistribute any command tokens on the command sheet by moving them between any of the pools. All exhausted cards are readied. These could include planets, technology, and strategy cards. Some units during the action phase may have been turned on their side to indicate they had sustained damage. At this point, they are turned upright to indicate they have been repaired. We'll talk a little bit more about that later as well. And finally, all strategy cards are returned to the common pool. At this point, if the Custodian's token is still on Mechatol Rex, the players will begin a brand new round. However, if it has been removed from Mechatol Rex, an agenda phase begins. The Custodian's token represents the caretakers that safeguard Mechatol Rex until one of the great races, played by the players, can claim the throne. Players may freely move units into the Mechatol Rex system during the game, but cannot actually land ground forces on the planet while the Custodian's token is present. To remove this token, the active player must spend 6 influence immediately prior to landing ground forces on the planet. Under no circumstances may ground forces land on the planet if this token is still there. Once this 6 influence is spent, the player claims the Custodian's token. He then places it in his play area and gains 1 victory point. At this point, the agenda phase will be added as the last phase of each game round, including the current round. After the agenda phase has been added to the game, the Galactic Council votes upon issues that affect the entire galaxy. These issues are referred to as agendas, as you may have guessed, and are represented by agenda cards, seen here. Each agenda card has text that includes a number of possible outcomes. Each outcome will affect the game, and players will vote for which outcome they want to occur. The agenda phase is resolved in 3 steps: first agenda, second agenda, and ready planets. To resolve an agenda, the player performs the following steps. First, they need to reveal the agenda. The speaker will draw 1 agenda card from the top of the agenda deck. The speaker then reads it aloud to all players, including its possible outcomes. In this case, economic equality, directive. 4. Each player returns all of his trade goods to the supply, then each player gains 5 trade goods. Against, each player returns all of his trade goods to the supply. Next, the players will vote. Each player, starting with the player to the left of the speaker and continuing clockwise, casts votes in favor of a single outcome. When it's a player's turn to cast votes, she may exhaust any number of her planets. Each planet contributes a number of votes equal to its influence value. So in this case, 3 votes. The outcomes that a player can vote for depend upon the type of agenda. You've already seen the for and against type card. In this case, the player commits her votes for or against the agenda. Some cards will say elect player. The player will commit her votes for the player of her choice, which could include herself. In this case, the player commits her votes for the planet of her choice, and that planet must be controlled by a player unless the agenda specifies otherwise. When casting votes, the player simply announces the outcome she is voting for aloud. For example, the player may say, "I'm casting 3 votes for this directive." A player can only vote for one outcome per agenda. In other words, she may not split her votes. However, she can choose to abstain entirely if she wants. During each vote, players may freely negotiate transactions with any of the other players. However, they may only negotiate up to 1 transaction with each other player. Often, this will involve convincing players with trade goods or future promises. Finally, players count all the votes and resolve the outcome with the most votes. Each agenda will be either a directive or a law. If it is a directive, players resolve the outcome that received the most votes immediately. The agenda card is then discarded. When resolving a law with a for and against possibility, if the for outcome received the most votes, or if the law requires an election, the law's effect becomes a permanent part of the game. Players will resolve this outcome and then place the agenda card in the common play area so that other players may reference it at any time. If an against outcome received the most votes, players resolve the text effect of the outcome and then discard the agenda immediately. In the case of a tie, the speaker has the tiebreaker vote. After the first agenda is resolved, a second one will be drawn and resolved in the same fashion. Finally, players will ready all of their planet cards, at which point the agenda phase ends and the players begin a new round, starting with the strategy phase. Let's discuss a few additional rules players will need to know in order to play the game, starting with action cards. Throughout the game, players will accumulate action cards. Players can use action cards to resolve powerful one-time abilities. Each player may have a maximum of 7 action cards at a time, and if a player ever exceeds this number, she must choose which 7 she wishes to keep and discard the rest. Each action card will indicate specifically when it can be used at the top of the card. For instance, after one of your ships is destroyed during a space combat or at the start of an invasion. When an action card is used, the player using it reveals the card, resolves the effect, and then discards the card. If an action card begins with the word action, as you see here, it can be used as a component action during the player's turn of the action phase. Trade goods are a universal currency that players will use to produce units or bribe other empires. A player may spend a trade good as either one resource or one influence. Players may also accumulate commodities. A commodity represents a product that is plentiful within the player's empire, and commodities have no inherent value but become trade goods when given to another player. During the game, players may replenish commodities by using the abilities of the Trade Strategy card. When a player replenishes commodities, she takes commodity tokens from the supply until she has a number of tokens equal to the commodity value on her faction sheet. A player can never have more commodities than that printed value. When a player gives another player a commodity, that commodity immediately turns into a trade good for that other player. Players are encouraged to replenish commodities through the Trade Strategy card and then trade them to one another in mutually beneficial transactions. As players expand into the galaxy, they will undoubtedly come into contact with other players' empires, and this may often lead to war, but it does not have to. Neighboring players can peacefully trade with each other. If a player has a unit or controls a planet in a system that is adjacent to a system that contains a unit or planet that another player controls, those two players are neighbors. So in this case, the red player is a neighbor with the blue player and the black player. During the active player's turn, he may negotiate a transaction with one or more of his neighbors, even during combat. As part of a transaction, the negotiating player may exchange any number of trade goods and commodities. However, the active player may only negotiate once with each of his neighbors per turn. Once that transaction has been finalized, no other transactions may occur between those two players during this turn. It's possible that players will negotiate transactions that go beyond simple exchange of goods. These transactions are referred to as deals. For example, the active player might move a ship into a system that has another player's PDS. The active player might offer the owner of that PDS a trade good to refrain from using the space cannon ability. Because this deal can be resolved immediately, it is called a binding deal. When a deal is binding like this, the players must honor the deal. So, in this case, the blue player will be required to not fire on this ship with the PDS since he accepted the deal. However, not all deals are binding. For example, on the blue player's turn, he may offer trade goods for the red player not to attack him on the red player's next turn. The red player can accept this, but since this deal cannot be completely resolved right now, it is a non-binding deal. When it comes around to the red player's turn, she may decide to move in to the system after all and attack the blue player. Non-binding deals are never required to be fulfilled. During the game, players will gain technology in the form of technology cards. These provide players with powerful abilities and allow players to upgrade their units. Each player has an identical deck of technology cards that may be looked through at any time, as well as a number of faction technology cards that are set aside during setup. There are 4 basic colors of technology cards. A technology's color is indicated by a green, red, blue, or yellow symbol located on the lower right corner of the card. These symbols are used when researching technology. Each player begins the game, as you know, with a number of starting technologies. A player can then research new technologies from the deck during the game. Technologies are always placed face up in the player's play area. Any technologies face up in the player's play area are known as the player's owned technologies. Some technologies will have the word action in their card text, and these can be resolved as a component action. Some technologies are unit upgrade technologies. Unit upgrade technologies match a unit on a player's faction sheet, in this case, the carrier. When a player gains a unit upgrade technology, she places it over the unit on the faction sheet. The white arrows on the faction sheet indicate attributes that will be upgraded when the player buys this technology. Once the unit is upgraded, all the player's current units of that type and future units of that type now have the shown technology. So how do players research new technologies? Most often, researching will be made available to players through the technology strategy card. Players must satisfy the prerequisites of the technology they wish to research. Prerequisites are printed on the lower left side of the technology. Some technologies have no prerequisites, and some have multiple of different colors. To satisfy prerequisites, a player must own a matching technology. So if these are the 2 the player owns, then this prerequisite is met with this card. Once that prerequisite is met and the player researches the new technology, that is now an owned technology, and now the player has 2 of these green icons, which would in turn make a card such as this available for research. It should be noted that since unit upgrades have no icon in this corner, they do not satisfy any prerequisites. Some planets provide players with a technology specialty indicated by that icon. If a player controls a planet with a technology specialty symbol, then she may exhaust that planet when researching technology to ignore a prerequisite that matches the technology specialty. In this case, the player could ignore 1 yellow prerequisite. While researching, it should be noted that players can exhaust planets for their technology specialty or for their resources, but not for both. Most planets outside of home systems have certain traits, indicated by these icons. This means the planet is cultural, this means industrial, and this means hazardous. These traits have no inherent game effect, but often will be referred to by certain cards and abilities. Now let's talk about unit abilities. Planetary shield, such as the one found here on the PDS-1, means that the planet where that unit is located is not an eligible target for other units' bombardment abilities. The sustained damage ability, like the one found here on the Dreadnought 1, means this unit will become damaged to cancel 1 hit. A damaged unit is turned on its side. A damaged unit still functions completely the same way as it did previously. Also, a damaged unit cannot use the sustained damage ability again until it is repaired, meaning if it takes another hit, it will be destroyed. A unit with a production ability, such as the Space Dock 1, can produce new units. This ability is always followed by a value which dictates the maximum number of units that unit can produce in a turn. Anti-Fighter Barrage is used during the Anti-Fighter Barrage step of the first round of space combat. These hits can only be assigned to fighters. You'll also notice 9x2 after the ability. What this means is a player must roll at least a 9 in order to cause a hit with this ability. And the x2 means the player will roll 2 dice when using this ability. Bombardment, as seen with the Dreadnought 1, is used during the bombardment step of an invasion. These hits can only be assigned by the bombarded player to ground forces on the planet being bombarded. If there are multiple planets in the system, the active player must choose which of his units in the system are bombarding which planets before rolling the dice. And the Space Cannon ability can be used at 2 different times. It can be used after the movement step of a tactical action. All players in the active system can use Space Cannon at this time. All hits from either side are assigned to ships in the active system. It can also be used during the Space Cannon defense step of an invasion. This time, the player who controls the planet being invaded can use the Space Cannon ability, and the invading player must assign these hits to his ground forces that are invading the planet. And finally, before we discuss the winning conditions, let's talk about Promissory Notes. Each player begins the game with 5 Promissory Note cards, 4 of which match the player color, and 1 which is faction specific. A promissory note helps players negotiate with each other by creating an enforceable contract between them. A player can offer a promissory note to another player as part of a transaction. Each one contains text that describes the card's effect and indicates when the card can be resolved. A player cannot resolve his own promissory note, but he can resolve other players' notes that he receives from a transaction. So for instance, political secret, when an agenda is revealed, the red player cannot vote, play action cards, or use faction abilities until after that agenda has been resolved. Then return this card to the red player. When a player resolves a promissory note, he reveals the card and resolves its text effect. Though some promissory notes will stay in play after they are resolved, the promissory note is usually returned to the original owner and may again be offered by that player as part of a transaction in the future. When a player offers a promissory note to another player as part of a transaction, the offering player may allow the receiving player to view the card being offered if he wishes. A player cannot trade more than 1 promissory note during a single transaction, however. Players are also allowed to exchange promissory notes that have been received from other players, and this does not require permission from the promissory note's original owner. A game of Twilight Imperium immediately ends when one player has gained 10 victory points. Victory points mainly will be obtained through completing public and secret objectives, as we've discussed in the past. With public objectives, any number of players can score each of these objectives. However, a player cannot score a public objective if he does not control all the planets in his home system. Only the player who holds the secret objective may score that particular secret objective. However, each player cannot have more than 3 total scored and unscored secret objectives. If he draws a secret objective and has more than 3, he must choose one of his unscored secret objectives and return to the deck. Then he shuffles the secret objective deck. Each objective specifies when a player can score it, either during the status phase or during the action phase. At the time the player scores the objective, it must be fulfilled right then. For instance, with this one, control 4 planets that each have the same planet trait. This would be scored during the score objective step of the status phase. The player at that time must control the 4 planets. Having controlled 4 of them earlier but not currently is not good enough. Players can score some objectives by spending resources, influence, or tokens as described on the objective card. In this case, a total of 6 tokens from the tactic and or strategy pools. To score such an objective, the player must pay the specified cost at the time indicated, in this case, the status phase. If an objective's timing specifies action phase, the player can score it during the action phase immediately after he fulfills its requirements. When the player fulfills an objective, she'll place a control token on the objective to show that she cannot score that one again and gain the indicated number of victory points. If the player scores a secret objective, she'll reveal it in front of her before placing the control token on it and scoring the victory points. As a reminder, each player can only score 1 public and 1 secret objective during the status phase and during each step of the action phase. If no one has scored 10 victory points and there are no more objectives to reveal, when the speaker would reveal an objective but cannot, the game immediately ends and the player with the most victory points wins the game. If there was a tie, the player among the tie players who is earliest in the initiative order wins the game. And that's how you play Twilight Imperium 4th edition. Thank you so much for watching the video. I hope you found it helpful and informative. I hope you'll come back for more videos in the future. Please be sure to subscribe and like this video. And until next time, if you're bored online, board offline.